Yeah, we'll get them to high school. There's so many that eventually stop.
Just 1 second. Hi there, and welcome to today's SCOPE webinar, one of the last 2 talks in our series that features Yukon University research chairs and leaders. We're hosting this talk with respect and gratitude on the traditional territory of the Kwanlundun First Nation and the Tanquatching Council. My name is Sabrina Kinsella, and I'm the Acting Senior Science Advisor for Yukon Government. Our speaker today was born and raised outside of Carcross, Yukon, an upbringing that helped him develop a deep reverence for the natural world. From his studies in landscape ecology to his work to share knowledge about the natural world with young Yukoners as coordinator of YukonU's youth STEM programs, Robin Mennell has demonstrated his ongoing commitment to learning and sharing about the land and its inhabitants. Today, we'll hear about the research that Robin conducted in pursuing his master's degree in geography through Queen's University, a study of the range use of the declining Bathurst caribou herd in NWT and Nunavut over a more than 20-year period. I'll turn the floor over now. Thank you for joining us, Robin.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Again, my name's Robin. The title of this talk is Spatial and Temporal Trends in Range Use by the Bathurst Caribou during a Population Decline. So from 1997 to 2019. This is a SCOPE presentation, and like Sabrina said, this is a presentation on my thesis results, my master's thesis. So I have to give a shout out to my supervisor, Dr. Ryan Danby from Queen's University. So it looks like there's a lot of people on, so thank you so much for showing interest in this. And I'll try my best to keep the talk to about 30 minutes so that we can have a bit of a discussion afterwards. So Sabrina kind of talked a bit about who I am. So I was born and raised in Yukon. This is, I have the utmost passion for the North. I really love the North. I really love, especially the outdoor world. And so when I got the chance to do a thesis that would take me into the tundra of Northwest Territories and pursue ecology, I was so thrilled. It was so amazing to be able to get to do a project on the North. So these are some pictures from my fieldwork. NWT has a lot less mountains than the Yukon, so you get these incredibly beautiful sunsets, just these incredibly picturesque landscapes. And of course, maybe getting tired along the way, as well as having a lot of fun along the way. That was a 40-day canoe trip where we went all through the tundra. It was incredible. This is a picture of me defending my thesis last summer. My thesis got broken up during the pandemic, like many things. You can see I'm on the top left. I'm a very happy camper. And in the top right, Dr. Ryan Danby is also happy. And there's the thesis committee. So a bit about caribou. So the Bathurst caribou, the type of caribou that I'm going to be talking about today, is a barren ground caribou. So barren ground caribou utilize incredibly large seasonal ranges, annual and seasonal ranges. So you can see in the middle, there's the Bathurst caribou in blue. It overlaps with Nunavut and Northwest Territories. And at one point going all the way into northern Saskatchewan. So quite a massive range. These are the caribou too, when you think of really large herds of caribou, when you have upwards of thousands, hundreds of thousands of individuals, this is the type that form these massive herds. So I talked about seasonal ranges. So in the summer, typically they live on the tundra, and then they migrate into the taiga, the boreal forest during the winter. So they have these kind of 2 landscapes that they use. Movement and timing is incredibly important for caribou. They conduct a spring migration to get to their calving range in the north. They're moving all throughout the range throughout the year. In fact, they move a lot. So this is a map of Northwest Territories. You can see Great Bear Lake, Great Slave Lake, and Bathurst Inlet. This is a kind of a crude map of their ranges, or of their winter, summer, and the calving ranges. Anyway, so when spring comes, they migrate up to the calving range. That's where the females give birth to calves. They nurse, and then when they're able to walk fully, they then migrate back into the summer range, where they forage, try to avoid insects before eventually going kind of between the ranges to rut, and then they migrate back into their winter ranges. So you can see that they have these different seasonal ranges that they occupy at different times of the year. So bearing ground caribou, when we think about them globally, on the right-hand side is a picture of all the different kind of herds of caribou around the circumpolar north. And on the left-hand side is their population estimates in 2018. So if you look at the black, that's the current population estimates for these caribou herds, and then the gray being their maximums, what they could be up to. And if you kind of look down, a lot of the caribou herds are quite in serious decline, especially if you look at the Bathurst, the Kamanariak herd, the George River, they're a fraction of what they could be. And so I kind of, if we look at the porcupine caribou is doing good. And I almost want this to serve this talk as a reminder not to take our own caribou for granted, because if we look at the circumpolar north, lots of caribou are facing troubles. So the decline of the Bathurst caribou. In 1986, this caribou was at almost 500,000 individuals. And then all the way to 2019, they experienced a 99% decline. Right now, the most recent estimate I saw was 6,000 individuals. When I finished my master's, it was 8,000. So they've continued to decline even now. So it's incredibly concerning. At the start of my study period, 1996, you can see there's still quite a lot of caribou, 349,000. So lots of experts, lots of different knowledge keepers consider the decline is outside of their natural cycle. It's really important to note that caribou do cycle between high and low populations, but it's not like the lynx or the hare cycle that's very consistent. It's very predictable. It's a little bit less predictable with caribou. So, but many still feel that this decline is outside what we would naturally expect a caribou to go through. So it's really important to note that caribou herds like this are incredibly important ecologically. Barren ground caribou make up incredible masses of vertebrates in the north. So they have an intrinsic tie on the land for both the predators that eat them, the plants that they eat, the mosquitoes and the black flies that eat them as well. They're intrinsically part of the land. And so when they disappear like this, you can have cascading effects ecologically. And socially, this animal has been incredibly important to numerous indigenous groups through the north for generations. These groups have co-evolved with this herd, lived sustainably with this herd for many, many generations. So this is incredibly concerning to all the communities and groups that have lived and understand the reverence of this herd. Yeah. So what is causing this decline? That's kind of the magic question, right? Why is this herd experiencing such massive decline? Well, the answer is not easy, and more experts and researchers look to this term cumulative effects. So cumulative effects is the idea that it's not necessarily any one thing, it's many things acting in combination together. It's a population, it's ecology. There's lots of different things that can affect herd health. This is also like death by 1,000 cuts. So does harvesting have an effect on their population? Yes, of course. But it's also increased forest fires within their winter range. We've seen an increase in forest fires, both in severity and frequency, and this can really damage their lichen availability in the winter. There's been changes in vegetative phenology, and what phenology is the timing in plants on their range, particularly their calving range. When they go up to calve, there's a lot of nutritious, they time that so that it's with graining, like green up, so that there's lots of nutritious forage so that they can provide milk for their calves. It's very nutritionally demanding. So is timing out of sync? Is that affecting their health? Industrial activity. There are 3 current mines operating, big mines, and lots of smaller claims operating within the range of the caribou. And it's not just these point sources, it's also the roads and all the activity that goes along with them, increased access, lots of different things going on within the range. Changes in habitat. Researchers have shown a phenomenon called Arctic greening, which is the change in productivity of plant life is changing in Arctic in different places. And this potentially can have a change in the composition and assemblage of plants and their forage, and potentially may be affecting their health. Increased insect activity. Researchers like Witter have shown that summers are becoming longer, warmer, wetter. The conditions are more and more ripe for insects. And insects live intrinsically with these caribou. They can consume liters of blood per week because there's so much harassment on these caribou. So a lot of these factors can be acting together. So because there's so many different factors, disentangling how each one of them might be affecting the caribou is very difficult. That's why it's really important to have a broad scale geographic studies. One of the reasons that I took this approach. And so it's important to note that both elders and researchers have been noting that there are geographical changes in this herd. And so we wanted to build off the work by these knowledge keepers and do a deep dive on some of the geographical changes, both in migration and range use, to kind of better speculate on how things might be shifting and serve as a starting block for other researchers to take it further. So the goal of my master's thesis was to determine how caribou phenology, so the timing in those range uses and where they're using the range use, has changed over the course of the population decline from 1997 to 2019. To do that, I wanted to accomplish 3 objectives. The first was to conduct a movement analysis that examined changes in the start and in duration of seasonal habitat use. So the seasonal ranges we looked at were their winter range, spring migration, their calving range, post-calving, their late summer range, fall rut, and their fall migration range. So 7 different ranges, looking at the changes in the timing of those ranges. Objective 2, to create maps of their annual and seasonal ranges each year to determine how areal extent has changed, but not just how area has changed, also the geography of these ranges. Is there any shifts in where these seasonal ranges are happening? And then finally, conduct a spatial analysis that explores temporal changes in range use. And so what I mean by that is looking at specific places and has there been an increase or decrease in their use throughout the years. So my methods, the data comes from GNWT. This is collar data that we had access to through a data sharing agreement. So GNWT started a collaring program in 1996. The first full year was 1997, so of points across the whole year. So that's why we started in 1997. You can see that there's different number of caribou collared each year, generally with an increase. So it's also important to note that these caribou are collared for a maximum of about 3 years before the collar falls off and they put it on a different animal. So it cycles through lots of different caribou. So these collars take spatial data. They take both location and time, which with those 2 pieces of data, we can do a lot. And in our analysis, we removed males because males don't necessarily take part in that spring migration at the same time in the same way. And we wanted to really capture the timing in that event. So this is just a snapshot of 2 years of data. This is 2018 and 19, all the different points and all the different caribou. So you can see there's a lot of data just in those 2 years. And so again, this is a crude map of Northwest Territories and Nunavut. So the movement analysis that I did was one that's called residence time. So this is a movement analysis that is used to categorize animal behavior. It's being used more and more on this type of data, on telemetry data. Essentially what it does is it puts a radius on each point, and it calculates how much time the caribou is spending within that predefined radius. What's really neat about this, this method is that radius is defined through the area restricted search. So what that is, that's a whole other analysis that you do to find the radius that is most pertinent to this animal. So scale is defined, so you don't have to subjectively choose scale. And loosely, what area restricted search is the maximum area that an animal will randomly search for a resource within its habitat before moving on to a new area. So this is pretty complicated, so I'm going to try to give you a little diagram to kind of show you how this might capture different types of behavior. So if we have an animal that is foraging within its winter range, for example, it's a little bit more sedentary at this time. So we have that radius centered on that point. That animal is moving around its habitat looking for food, but it's conducting these random searches because it might not necessarily know where the best food is, and it's a little bit more sedentary. So it's moving around at different random kind of angles. What you can see is all the circles, there's lots of overlap. So when an animal is doing foraging behavior, it's not migrating, we get really high residence times because there's a lot of overlap. It's residing in that area for a long period of time. Now, if an animal is migrating, it's going to be breaking that circle a bit more because it knows where it wants to get to, and it's going to be moving quickly. So we get behavior that looks a little more like this. It's a little more directed And so we actually get quite low residence times. So on the right-hand side, this is a snapshot from 1 year of a residence time graph throughout the year of the herd, the black line being the average residence time of the herd throughout the year, the blue being the standard deviation. And then if we corroborate this with what we know, like how sedentary or how much these animals are moving generally throughout the year, we can gain a lot of information. So we know, the highest residence times are going to be in winter when they're the most sedentary, they have to move through snow. Of course, they're going to be slowest. But also in that changes and that slope changes. And that's when spring migration starts. That residence time becomes quite low because they're moving very quickly, they're migrating, but then they get to their calving range and then they stop for a bit because they need to give birth, they need to eat. And so that we get a bit of a resurgence of residence time. They leave that again for their post-calving, and then they move until insects kind of die down in the late fall and they can be a little more sedentary, enjoy their foraging in the later summer and fall. And then later they'll move again to go rut around October. We know that caribou are rutting at that time, and then they take part in their fall migration back into their winter range. So we use a technique called Labiel's segmentation to segment this data. It's done on stochastic data like this. So what that type of segmentation does is and it was also designed for telemetry data like this, done by other caribou researchers. What the segmentation data does is you give this data set, you determine how many segments you want, and it does its best to group similar data. But what it's really good at is detecting these change points, like the spring migration when that slope changes, for example. So we use this technique to determine the timing in events annually, so it's seasonal events annually. And then we did linear regression on the Julian date to determine if, is spring migration starting a little bit earlier each year, or is it ending earlier? So we did that on start, end, and duration of each of these ranges. Then we used a type of mapping called Brownian bridge mapping. So this is a really neat type of mapping done on telemetry data. What this does is it is a map that's conducted on each individual caribou, and then you take a herd average. It's a little bit different than how caribou have been mapped in the past. But what's really cool about it is it takes into account that time piece, right? So it creates a probability distribution of where the caribou are based on the points you give it. You see on the right-hand side, these kind of two peaks. So that's obviously the points, and then probability falls away, right? But there's this narrow bridge between them where probability is a little higher, and that's because that's the movement corridor. So Brownian bridge uses an algorithm to take into account that movement. Kernel density assumes that each one of these points is independent, that each one of those points is its own caribou, when that might actually not be the case. It might be one caribou moving through its habitat. And we want to capture that movement data because it's incredibly useful. So we use this mapping technique to map them annually and seasonally, and then we used it to look at aerial change. And again, I think that Brownian bridge within the literature is better than kernel density. This is a snapshot, an old kind of figure that I used to just kind of give you an indication of what I mean by that movement. So on the left-hand side, we have a crude map, Brownian map, with red being higher probability of caribou and dark blue being almost no probability. And then on the right-hand side, the tracks and all the points overlaid. And so what you see is it's really capturing the movement of these caribou, right? Rather than just having a fuzzy boundary around these individual points, it's actually capturing the directionality that they're moving, which is really useful when you're looking at movement. So we took these maps, we took it a little bit further. We did an ellipse analysis on these maps, both the seasonal and annual ranges. What the ellipse analysis does is it calculates the standard deviation in both the X and Y direction of those polygons that you give it to create an ellipse, right? This ellipse is really useful because it tells you generally how geographically spread out that range might be in that year. It also gives you a geographic center of the range, which you then can map to see if there's any shifts in either the annual or the seasonal ranges. And then the last thing that we did was a linear regression analysis. So this is where we stack all of our seasonal maps and our annual maps. And then we do linear regression on the overlapping pixels to see if there's a trend in caribou use increasing from year to year and treating each year as it's, the herd range use that year. And so the map, the result of this is a map where every pixel is a slope rate of change, whether that's increasing, decreasing, or staying the same. So the residence time, our results, we got a timeline graph like this from 1997 all the way to 2019 of kind of the timing in each one of those ranges. So blue is winter range, pink is spring migration, dark pink is calving, light green is post-calving, dark green is late summer, purple is fall rut, and light blue is fall migration. So you can see these things are kind of happening at the same time each year, but there actually is a little bit of a shift. So when we do the linear regression on those Julian dates to see if there's a trend, spring migration is finishing significantly earlier. So that means also calving is happening significantly earlier. Post-calving, this is an interesting result that we didn't expect, was happening or is finishing significantly later and becoming significantly longer. And late summer, obviously, becoming significantly later. When we look at our mapping, so from 1997 to 2019 on the left, you can kind of see how the area that these caribou use is generally decreasing throughout the years. Where in 1997, dipping into northern Saskatchewan, 2019, the bottom of the range almost being a tree line. So being a lot, it's winter range almost moving into tundra again. And then on the right-hand side, we have all the declines just charted out. So the annual range decreased by 90% over the course of the study period, with things like the spring migration range and the winter range declining by 90% to 87%, so huge decreases. The calving range, however, only declined by 35%. So it's not declining at the same proportion that the herd is declining. From our ellipse analysis, if you look on the left-hand side, red is being the start of that annual or seasonal range, and then the big black dot being the end. If we look at our our annual range, moved about 200 kilometers in the northwestern direction. Winter moving even further, same with spring migration. But looking at calving, even when we zoom in, it's very consistent year to year, the geographic center. Post-calving and late summer, there was some shifts, but really it's winter, fall migration, fall rut, and spring migration that are changing in this northwest direction. So it's almost like an accordion that's been pinned, and the range is being squeezed up to that calving range. I'm just going to show you a couple of results from that linear regression analysis. So on the left-hand side, this is a map of their spring migration, where every pixel, again, is a slope rate of change, with red generally being an increase in use and blue generally being a decrease in use. And so on the right-hand side, what we get is just the pixels that came up significant. And what's really interesting is we almost have these two corridors. So these two, you can see these elongated corridors that seem like migration corridors that potentially are being abandoned. Late summer is a really interesting result. So if we look on near Contoida Lake, which is this big lake in just on the border of Nunavut and Northwest Territories, there's an increase in use along this lake throughout the study period, and a decrease in use in the southwest, which is very similar to what we saw with that ellipse analysis, that kind of same directionality going actually northeastern. So that's my results, that's my methods. This is where I get to talk about what I think it all means. I think it's very important to note that we didn't compare things to environmental covariates. So a lot of the discussion is speculation, so that other researchers can kind of jump off this and look at finer trends. So aerial changes. So range contraction has coincided with population decline, with winter and spring migration declining the most. How we interpret this is that great caribou are very gregarious animals. They really love being together. So as their ranges have declined, they've strived to maintain high densities, right? It's mirroring essentially the decline of the herd. When caribou are in high densities, they have better defense against predators, also better defense against insects. Their survivorship is higher. They're very gregarious animals. When we look at geographical changes, so the winter range and spring migration have moved a lot in the northwest direction, with the calving changing actually not that much. So I'm going to give you a couple of thoughts what I think might be happening there. One of the thoughts is that lichen is a very limiting ingredient for caribou. So in the winter, caribou have to spread out. Their winter range is often the most spread out so that each caribou has adequate access to lichen. But as the herd declines in population, the need to spread out and necessarily go all the way to northern Saskatchewan also declines. They can have adequate access because there's so few caribou. That's potentially one interpretation. The other is that like I noted, that there's been forest fires in the boreal range. It might be that the forage quality is declining, and so it's actually better forage quality near that tree line, like I had said. And the final one is what researchers are showing. Other animals, other animals their ranges are increasing in the north direction. So we get new predators, grizzly bears, eagles. Their ranges are shifting, they're moving north. We also have new competitors like deer, and it might be that they are responding to these new competitive, both predators and competitors, and that might be another reason why that range particularly is moving north. Calving has changed the least. I think this should be a testament to how important the calving range is to them. Like I had said before, the nutritional forage, calving is a place of refuge from predators and insects, but also a time where they can restore their fat reserves after winter. And so the timing of vegetation and all these kind of factors make it a really important place for them. So it seems like they're still utilizing the area the best they can, even with smaller populations. Contota Lake has become an important or a more important location. They've always used Contota Lake. One of the things that the Boots on the Ground program, which I'll talk about them in a second, have noticed is that on the south end of Contota Lake, caribou are utilizing it as a wind refuge because of the high winds that come off this really big lake from insects. So as the population declines, their ability to defend against insects also decreases. Big lakes like this might become more important as a defense for that. So that's an interpretation of mine. Migration routes are changing. Again, an interpretation. It looks like migration routes are changing. I think the next step would be really to kind of compare that to potentially some of the industrial activities that are happening there, but also some of the habitat changes like the ones I talked about with Arctic greening. Phenological trends, so the trends in their movement. We're seeing a calving happening earlier, not necessarily that they're giving birth, but they're getting to their calving range earlier. This may be in response to that advancing spring, trying to be in line with the onset of vegetation. There's a window where it's most nutritious, and it's when it first appears on the tundra. So it may be in response to that. Post-calving, that movement after calving is becoming longer. So they're moving a lot more after calving. And potentially this is an insect defense. Movement is a really good defense against insects, especially when you don't have a huge population. The concern, if that's true, is that the more calves have to move after calving, the more researchers have shown that can have an effect on their survivability. And also insects really prey on calves because of their thin skin. So in conclusion, these changes, one thing I needed to note is that they're not necessarily consistent with other declining herds. But what's really interesting is that some of them are. Researcher has shown that the Kamanariak herd is shifting its range so that calving is actually happening earlier, similar to ours. Whereas other ones, like the George River, Newfoundland, they're not seeing the same trends phenologically. So it might be that the Bathurst are acting based on local factors. A lot of these changes are not spatially homogeneous across the north. So it's possible that animals are responding to their own geographies. Ultimately, it seems like migration behavior and range use is changing. I hope that this research serves as the next step to look at some of these environmental covariates that we looked at and do a much finer look on to see why are these things changing. Particularly, I think that we need to have more studies on insects and insects presence in the north. It's not the most glamorous PhD or master's. I think a lot more people want to study caribou, but the few authors that have published on presence of insects is so invaluable, that information. I think it's a big piece of the puzzle. Strict conservation measures are needed. I think that goes without saying, and I want to unpack what conservation means to me a little bit, because the government has really strict conservation measures on the Bathurst herd. But I think conservation is not necessarily just government policy. It's not necessarily just having these conservation zones. Conservation is also scientists, researchers sharing their data with one another, being collaborative, having stakeholders come together and be amicable towards one of each other. That's also conservation. Conservation is bringing youth and community members that it affects into the problems. I think that's a huge piece of what conservation is. So what's next for me? Currently, I'm working on a publication with my supervisor. Right now I'm working with YukonU STEM program. So I get to impart a lot of my love of conservation, my love of biology and caribou with young people, young youth. I think it's really rad to get to talk to them. I think it has a big impact on these problems that plague us all. There's a couple things I want to plug. So the Danby Lab is still busy. They've just published a paper called Satellite Analysis of Caribou Habitat Change. This goes into some of that stuff that I talked to you about before, that Arctic greening trends. Really cool piece. And they have a plain language summary as well. So check that out. The other thing I really want to plug is the Boots on the Ground program. I think anybody that's joining from Northwest Territories knows what this program is, but maybe many of you from the Yukon don't. What it is it's a program that the Klitschko government does where they bring youth, they bring elders and different community members to Contoido Lake, and they monitor the caribou. They bring all these people that this problem affects into the monitoring of this caribou. And they typically do that on Contoido Lake, and then they publish the results publicly. So this is a really cool program. You should really check them out and check out what they're doing, because I think a program like this in the Yukon would be fantastic. I think a program like this nationwide would be incredibly fantastic. Yeah, so that's my presentation. I want to thank you so much, Scope and YukonU, for hosting this. And of course, I want to thank all the sponsors that paid for my thesis, including Queen's, the SIMP funding, NSTP, and ACANS, the Association of Canadian Universities. And I'll pass it back to Sabrina for questions.
Thank you very much, Robin. That was really interesting. Great presentation. It's something I just wanted to highlight is that the topic of insects came up in our last talk as well. And Tara Stalen was talking about the connection to migratory bird shifts. And so clearly that's an area we need to encourage someone to investigate here in the north.
Yeah. There's one more thing sorry that I forgot to mention was because the pandemic had cut my thesis short, there was plans to come back to NWT and meet with a lot of the stakeholders, and I didn't get the chance to do that. It's still on our radar. It's still something I want to do because I think that's incredibly important. And I love Yellowknife, and I love all the people in NWT. So just added that piece.
I was born in Yellowknife, so I'm going to take that as a compliment. We've got one comment in the chat that I'll read out, and then I'll look to folks for questions. Again, you can use your reaction button to raise your hand, or I'll scan those who have their videos turned on, which is nobody right now, to see raised hands. Again, you can type a question into the chat. We've got one hand raised, that's great. But first, I'll just read out Bob's comment. He said, looking forward, there are proposals for roads to Bathurst Inlet and east to Nineveh. What could be, it's a question. What could be the impacts on an already decimated herd?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've heard about that road before. Yeah, I don't think you can say that there's no impact. I think roads do have impacts on things. It's not my field of expertise. I know that there are some researchers looking at the impact of roads on caribou. I think Angus out of the Yellowknife is looking at that, and I'd be really keen to see his results on that. What I can say is that I think this research, I think people really see that the calving range is an important place for the caribou. So I think that it could have an effect, and it's something that we would need to consider very carefully. Sorry, that's maybe worded very diplomatically. It's just not my field of expertise.
For the question and the answer there. Richard, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, hi there, Robin. Thanks for that talk, really interesting. Can't believe the numbers of caribou that have dropped off the map there. I just can't get my head around the main causation factors. You had a diagram with about 8 or 9 influencing factors, but not more detail on what is actually taking those numbers down to such ridiculously small numbers. I mean, the thousands, you're in the thousands now rather than hundreds of thousands. Do you think any of the herders gone elsewhere and joined other herds?
Yeah, so actually in 2018, there's evidence within the collar data showing the herd, a couple of individuals migrating to a different herd. And when I scoured through the literature to figure out, what that meant, it looks like it has been documented where caribou do that. I don't think it happens often, but I think that also could exacerbate the population decline.
So do you think an individual within a herd would look at a herd and say they're doing better, or they're fatter, or they're bigger, and go, well, I'm going to go with that because they look more successful?
Yeah, and I think also potentially because they are gregarious, they want to be in bigger herds too, right? So I think that might, because sometimes when they're in the winter range, they're actually in this overlapping ranges. So there's a potential that that might be exacerbating population decline.
And in terms of the range, it seems to have stopped going so far south. Is that because it's warming up and they don't need to expend the energy to head down south? Or is it things getting hunted from the south and so they just stay away from there?
I think it can be a lot, like I said, I had kind of said 3 different proposals speculating on changes, but again, I think that is up for the other researchers to kind of compare it to those environmental covariates. Yeah, like I think it could be other animals moving into their range. It could be, access of lichen. It could be, fire damage. There's could be a whole different reasons why they don't go as far south.
Yeah, I guess if it's getting warmer and lichen don't want to grow, then no point in going south, is there? Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Richard and Robin. I've got a question I'll read out from the chat, and then I see a hand raised. So that's the order they came in. So from Salim, any thoughts about the concerns about collaring by some of the communities or Indigenous groups? For example, very few collars on Baffin Island. Obviously, trade-off with scientific data and traditional knowledge / Inuit knowledge.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of thoughts on that, Salim. Thanks for that question. Like I had known with the Bathurst herd that it was, not, when the collaring program came up, there had to be a lot of talks between different Indigenous groups in Nunavut and Northwest Territories, because a lot of concerns about the health, for example, from the collar of it being a radio transmitter. I think that, going forward, you have, like I said, conservation is all these stakeholders working together. So I think we need to listen to these concerns. And I think, it's better that we're all working collaboratively than independent, right? So I think, concerns about how many collars you have, maybe there is a way around that. I think the best thing that you can going forward is trying to be collaborative with all these different stakeholders. So listening to people's concerns up for data collection is definitely a relevant concern.
Thank you for that. Jan, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, it's Jan, by the way. Jan Adamczewski with GNWT in Yellowknife. Just a little more information on the question that was asked about caribou moving to other herds. So there's a little more recent information since Robin kind of was in his writing phase and so on. But so based on the satellite collars, we had a number of Bathurst females that were on the Bathurst calving ground the year before that ended up on the adjacent calving ground to the east, the Beverly Hayek caribou herd, which is much larger. The last estimate was about 100,000 in 2018. So we had 3 out of 11 known Bathurst females in 2018, 3 out of 17 in 2019. And then last year we had better collar numbers, but we had 6 out of 34 known Bathurst collared cows that ended up moving over to that jurisdiction. What we've also seen in every winter preceding that, based on the satellite collars, very heavy mixing of the Bathurst and Beverly Hayek. So then you have a very small herd mixed with a herd that outnumbers it by, 10 or 15. And so that emigration, which normally doesn't, we normally don't see very much movement of that kind. Usually the fidelity of the satellite collared cows to the calving ground is very high, 97, 98%. So this is actually a fairly unusual pattern. And what we've actually seen, and some of this comes from the Boots on the Ground program, Robin, the last 2 or 3 summers have actually been cooler, windier, more rain. So actually good feeding conditions for the caribou, and some of the demographic indicators have actually been improving with the Bathurst herd. So as it stands now, that movement to the east, joining a larger herd, is actually more of a concern for the herd's future than the internal demographics, the balance between mortalities and young animals coming in. So just a little bit of an update there, and definitely that is now that's a major concern for us, with the herd's future.
Thank you so much, Jan. Good. I'm so glad you could join my talk. Great to hear from you again.
Yes, and thank you very much for a very nice thesis and a great presentation. So yeah, give yourself a pat on the back.
Thank you.
Thank you, and my apologies, Jan.
No problem.
Okay, we've got 2 hands up. I'm not sure who raised theirs first, but I'll go with Alec first, and then Richard after.
Hi, I just want to say congratulations. That was a really very clear and really great communication. I thought that was, especially some of those methods are quite complicated. And anyways,
thank you. Yeah.
I think a lot of the questions that I sort of immediately have are about the sort of next work, tying what you're seeing to environmental variables and that sort of thing. So I'll save those because they're for later. But I guess, did you have a consistent number of individuals through that period as the population was declining? And how did you sort of control for a number of individuals through the period?
Like number of individuals collared?
Yeah, collared.
So there's a this is the kind of ever something that I actually had to answer in my thesis, how data quality changes throughout the years. No, so the numbers, there's an increase in numbers, and so we actually use different number of collared individuals each year, using the maximum that we can for kind of a proxy of that herd average. Generally with about an average of 20 caribou, and then some lower ones around 10, with some higher of 30. But yeah, being very careful about kind of the potential error that introduces, by being very careful, I guess, in our interpretation of the results, not being incredibly specific with the things that we're saying. Understanding this is, we're trying to get the most out of the data that we can to capture those movement, because there is generally an increase in data quality throughout the years.
Right.
But we really wanted to capture the big scope, be able to compare things from year to year. So that meant using as much as we possibly could, essentially.
But a range contraction with an increasing number of collars and a population declining, it's just interesting because it's very conclusive, right? When you have all those sort of things. If you had less collars and the range was contracting, it'd be sort of counter, but the results are really quite strong.
Yeah, and actually one other point to that was the originally I coded it so that it was all of the smoothing parameters match the data quality in the collar every year, right? But then what we saw was that a lot of the patterns that we were seeing was exacerbated by the data quality and not because of the actual phenomena, right? So we had to come up with an average for these parameters that we use throughout the years. Again, understanding that there is potential error introduced in those earlier years and the later years, but ultimately so that we can compare from year to year.
Right. Yeah, it's like a blessing to have such nice, like sort of long-term data, but can be quite challenging to work with.
Very, very challenging. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alec and Robin. Richard?
Thanks. Following on from Jan's input, and I don't know what you would call it, moving herd populations or integrating populations of herds. I presume food is your, I don't know, is it the main thing that determines the numbers that can graze on an area of tundra? I mean, you've got 2 corridors left that you were talking about. What's so peculiar about those 2 corridors that the caribou are working their way up and down those, as opposed to the adjacent corridors? Is it just ease of movement? Is it restriction of movement? Is it food along those corridors? And is 500,000 caribou going to overgraze an area and there's no food left? Is it like they've put themselves into extinction?
Okay, I think there's a couple of questions. The first being, I think, what is it about migratory corridors that caribou use consistently from year to year? Is that the first question? And is it forage? So yeah, there's a paper, I forget the author who looked at that. Some of the big kind of factors that influence why caribou utilize the same migration routes from year to year. Some of it is geographic, right? Like just what is the shortest distance and the ideal kind of lake crossings. But also having things like depth of snow. Certain places have more walkable terrain from year to year. And then also quality forage along the way. So there are a couple of different factors that go into having a migratory route being the same. And so that's why there's a bit of a concern if that switches to something else, are they taking a lower quality migratory route because of something else, right? And then I think, sorry, I missed the second part of the question.
Is it possible to overgraze?
Yes, oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's super documented. That's one of the theories about kind of what influences caribou cycle anyway, is caribou have been known to overgraze, particularly the winter habitat. Like they spread out a lot in their winter range, and absolutely possible to overgraze lichen, right, which takes a long time. And even when we looked at the maps of the winter ranges, they are moving around a lot. So it's very clear that throughout the years, they're going to different areas, especially in their winter range. And yeah, that's one of the theories that I kind of propose is why it may be, you know, when you have lots of animals, like 400,000 animals, they can overgraze, particularly the winter habitat. But as the population declines and there's only 6,000 individuals, lichen becomes less of a limiting factor, right? Even if areas have been overgrazed, there's so much fewer caribou that they don't necessarily need to go as far south to find all these patches. Is one interpretation, my interpretation, not necessarily. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. We do have time for a couple more questions. Well, maybe a few more, depending on how long they are. So again, if you're feeling shy and want to type it into the chat, please feel free and I can read it out on your behalf. Or if you just want to raise your hand, or with a quieter group of people might be able to just unmute without causing too much chaos. I did want to ask one question, and I think you might have covered this, so my apologies if so. You talked about that boots on the ground program, and so I was interested in like how involved knowledge keepers were with your project specifically, or if you were just more connected to other work that was going on.
Yeah, so I unfortunately, because because it's an academic institution, that was something I wanted to do a lot more, was go out to all these different communities and maybe even do some interviews, but it became a whole other process of having to get ethics approval and kind of develop a survey and consistent methodology. So instead, we went the approach of just speaking with a lot of different stakeholders, not recording it, but just using that information that they shared to inform. So that there was quite a huge process, a lot of money that went into me going and living in Yellowknife for a summer and just trying to meet with as many people. I spoke with someone like Jan a couple times and different Dene individuals that had been a part of monitoring. So informally, that's how we did it. Like, it's not recorded throughout my thesis. I really wanted it to be a bigger part. I hope that it'll become easier and easier for researchers to do that. Certainly a lot of the published work that elders have put out, I have like referenced throughout my thesis. I really wanted that information is so invaluable to this type of work. But yeah, that's kind of how we did it. Going to different governments, going to different stakeholders and meeting with them without doing these formal kind of surveys that incorporate their, yeah.
Thanks very much. And Richard, you've got your hand raised.
I don't know why I'm so curious around lunchtimes, but here we go. At the beginning, you showed some comparative numbers between different herds, and three you mentioned had dropped off the precipice, as it were. Do you know what the similarities are between those and those that are actually keeping their numbers, like the porcupine herd? I mean, why hasn't that been decimated?
Yeah, like I wish that had a more in-depth answer. I just I didn't include that reference in my thesis. I just found it for this talk because of a talk I had with Anne Gunn. She's one of the publishers of that piece. Yeah, and I wanted to. Yeah, I had speculated on why the porcupine caribou were doing so well when so many other caribou have done poorly. Some of the things that I just heard from people, I didn't actually read this, but where some of the geography, like the geography is a lot different, obviously, for the porcupine caribou. There's mountains, there's a little bit more geographic refuge, whereas the tundra is just an open barrens, right? So I heard this, I didn't read this, that sometimes those conditions can cause really big booms, right? Like when things are good, you can have a really big boom, and that's why the Bathurst can get to like 500,000 individuals, where the porcupine doesn't really get that high in number. So it's almost like these geographic features are kind of like buffers to population up and down. But again, that's just me hearing that I believe through some of these conversations, because it did come up a lot. Why is the porcupine doing well when so many caribou around the circumpolar north are in decline? It's not a great answer, but that's the best I can speak to it. I think, again, one of the things I wanted to get from my talk is that, us being Yukoners, to not take the porcupine caribou for granted. I wanted to check into environment. I didn't get the time to see if there's a range plan for the porcupine, like an in-depth one, like there is for the Bathurst, because I think this stuff is always better preventative than after the fact, right? Like after the herd has collapsed. So I hope that if there's people here that work for environment, that maybe we'll get the buzz going, that let's think about how sacred this animal is and not take it for granted.
Thanks, Robin.
Yeah, I think there are people from environment, but I won't call them out. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, Mike's here, so I'm here. I can speak to that. So I'm the regional biologist based up in Dawson and work on porcupine caribou. And yeah, just the first part of the question, I think, Robin, your explanation is not a bad one, actually, that there's vastly different geographies and topographies involved in these herds. The other thing to keep in mind is, if you look through time, the population increases and decreases of the porcupine herd have almost always differed, at least in recent memory, from all those other herds farther east. And there's a lot of different thoughts on what that could be in terms of bigger climatic oscillations. So that ties into it too. With respect to herd management plans, If folks aren't familiar with it, the Porcupine Caribou Management Board kind of has the purview for that. Environment Yukon's one partner along with many others. So there is a harvest management plan that's in place since 2010, I'm sorry. And we have been carrying that out on an annual basis ever since. We get together in February and kind of discuss it to make sure we're doing the right things in terms of harvest. On the land use planning side, we're actually in the process of pulling that together right now to kind of fill things out, as it were. So it probably won't be something exactly like the range management plan for the Bathurst herd, but just because it's very different scenarios in many ways. However, we are in the process of pulling that together collectively. And then the other thing to point out is that there is actually land use plans in place for almost the whole herds range in Canada right now, with the exception of within traditional territory. However, that's nearing recommendation phase at this point. So just to fill in some holes there.
Awesome, Mike. I would love to get together at some point and talk more. If you're the biologist up there, that'd be great.
Yeah, happy to do
Thanks
so
very much,
anytime, Robin.
We probably have time to squeeze in one more question or comment if anyone wants to chime in. Just scanning the crowd and looking for hands raised. If not, well, thanks very much, Robin, again, for an excellent presentation and a great discussion. Lots of good questions from the group too, so thanks to the audience for participating. And I hope to see folks next week. It's a bit of a step away from the YukonU series. We have a Swamplands author, Edward Strudzik, presenting. So hope to see some folks there. And just if you are joining, it's on Wednesday, not our usual Thursday. So don't miss it. Yeah, thanks again, Robin. And I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank you so much for everybody that showed up. Awesome.
I know.